This is Rue Ziegler interviewing Volker Eisele, November 18th, 2008. This is tape number 1 of the oral history series for the Jack L. Davies Agricultural Land Preservation Fund. Volker, I wondered if we could just start by getting your full name and your date and place of birth.
Volker Eisele. I was born August 7th, 1937 in Münster, Westfalen, a city in western Germany near the Dutch border.
And could you tell us a little bit about your early childhood, your parents, siblings, your early years of schooling?
Well, my first 4 years were relatively peaceful until the Second World War broke out, certainly, and my father became a soldier in 1939, and I saw him then sporadically, and we experienced a little bit of bombing, but it was kind of silly stuff in the early stages of the war, you might say. And
did you live in the countryside?
No, we lived in a city, and there was a high concentration of Army and Air Force in our city. So it was for sure going to be a target, as one can see retroactively. And in 1941, my father was released from the army because of a heart condition, and he was not very forward-looking because he took his young wife and son to a new job in a part of Poland that had been annexed by Germany, and he was professionally involved with agriculture, something like agricultural advising the way our universities do it here, and was there by companies that were organized by the government but run privately. And so they wanted to, the long-term idea was to bring German farmers to that area, and he would have to help them get settled. And part of these German farmers were supposed to be Germans who lived in other parts of Europe and who were brought, quote unquote, home by the Nazi regime from the Baltics, for example, and in other countries. And in that city on the Vistula River, my 2 sisters were born, and we left there in 1944, went to Silesia, to the capital of Silesia, where my godfather lived, my father's brother, with his wife.
Could I just interrupt for a minute? Could you just spell for the transcriber the name of the city in which you were born?
Münster is spelled M-U with an umlaut, N-S-T-E-R. In any case, we went to a city called Breslau, B-R-E-S-L-A-U, and we stayed there for a few months, and then my father brought us to the more northerly area until we had to leave there on January 30th, 1945, and we had to flee before the oncoming Russians. And at that point, my mother and my sister and I were the ones who had to do that, and it was absolutely horrible. It took us 4 weeks to cover about 200 miles, and it was a particularly cold winter, and the hardships were pretty bad. And my sister was only 2 years old, so it's very, very bad. very, very bad. And we got stuck in a town eventually near Berlin, 120 kilometers from Berlin, where we got sick with jaundice, I think it's called in English. We got it all, and so we couldn't travel further to the west, to the safe haven, supposedly, of American-British occupation. And so we were overruled by the Russians. So we had 500 Russian tanks come into town. And that was pretty brutal. And then we were for 2 years under Russian occupation. And then we fled that part of Germany and went to the west.
And what about your father?
He was dead by then, or he was missing in action. But we know now he died in February of 1945 on the front. He had been reactivated in 44, and he was killed on the front.
And where did your mother then take?
Eventually, I mean, I cannot give you all the details, but eventually we came back to mine and her hometown of Münster, where I lived until I came to this country.
And what was it that brought you to the U.S. and how old were you when you came?
I was 24. I came here in the early 60s and came in 63 to California and had a scholarship to go to Cal and went to graduate school at UC Berkeley.
So you had already graduated from Germany?
Well, yeah, I had not, but I still had a scholarship.
Had you gone to university in Münster?
Among others, yes, and another university in Germany.
And what were some of the early interests you had at university while you were still in Germany?
The early idea was to study law and have some other field, because everybody was becoming a lawyer and you needed some specialty, you might say. So I was interested in sociology and history. And when I came to Berkeley, I really focused on sociology and history. And when I decided to stay here in this country, that became sort of the goal, and I sort of gave up on the idea of the law. I had some wrong ideas about being a lawyer in this country. But if I had gone back to Germany, I would for sure have been a lawyer. And nowadays, I sometimes think it was too bad that I couldn't become a lawyer, that I didn't become a lawyer. So, but that's one of those missed opportunities in life.
Why, you think that would have enhanced your effectiveness somehow? Or?
No, if I'd become a lawyer, I probably wouldn't sit here in Childs Valley.
Where would you sit?
I would probably be retired on a nice house, Marin County or something, but I wouldn't do agriculture. That pursuit would not have happened. The interest for me was actually from the very beginning very much open space. And I do remember one thing very well, which I will tell you. The first time I went back to Germany, and I was staying with my closest friend, and he said, "What is it really? What draws you to America? What do you see there? I mean, come on. You're a European." And I had to really think about this very hard, and I did think about this. And I will tell you what I told him. I told him, for me, America is the geography, nothing else. I don't need Detroit culture. We have in Europe plenty. It's the geography, the wide open space and the wilderness. Of course, when I said that to him in the 60s, I had not yet comprehended how fast this country was destroying the wilderness and open space. But there was really, that interest was really strongly reinforced when I met my wife, and we had this weekend house 5 miles from here. And there were all these open spaces around us, very close, when you think about it, to the Bay Area, where you could just go. And we see the change in our short lifetime with the McMansions being built in that same area now. And it is to me still one of the unanswered questions for Americans. How can you destroy this country so fast and so thoroughly when you have the example of Europe with overpopulation and the destruction of natural spaces and wilderness in front of your eyes, you know, and it is going on and on and on, and all you have to do is open the newspaper nowadays, and you find the destruction from one end of the country, from Alaska to Florida, from Louisiana to California, you know. And most Americans are at fault, and they don't have a good answer because they're way too selfish and narrow-minded and less and less educated about these issues.
You're thinking less educated as the generations
Yes,
succeed.
very clearly, very clearly. It's a little footnote here. On Saturday, we were at a dinner dance in Berkeley with highly educated people. There were a lot of Hungarians from 1956, all super well educated, all speaking 4 or 5 languages. And we were sitting at the table with some professors from UC Berkeley, and they were all telling us that the quality of the students and the quality of the writings, where you see it more clearly, was going down from year to year.
That's very discouraging.
Yes, it is.
Well, I wonder if we could, I want to get back to your weekend house, but first we need to back up to find out when and how you met your wife, Liesel.
I met her May 30th, 1967, in her mother's house. I'd been invited there to a dinner party by my roommate and his girlfriend, who turned out to be a cousin of Liesel's. And Liesel's mother was gone, and so the cousin had a dinner party in the house and invited Liesel and to the house, and so we met, and it clicked immediately.
Now, Liesel was from where?
She was born in Germany, and she came here as a young child, and so she was bilingual, totally bilingual. And
what part of Germany did she come from?
she was born in Berlin, and that was more historical accident. Her father's family came from Silesia in southeast of Germany, which is now Poland. And her mother came from southern Germany, from Darmstadt. And her grandfather was a chemist, a doctor of chemistry for Merck, what Americans call Merck. It's of course originally the same firm, but it was taken away by the American government here, and it is now obviously an American firm here, but there's one in Germany with the same name.
I know that. So you met in May?
In Berkeley, on May 30th, 1967, in Berkeley.
Now, was Liesel also a student at Berkeley?
At the time, she was a graduate student in art history at UC Berkeley, but she had already done landscape architecture, which she did later on professionally, but she just wasn't satisfied with landscape architecture. It wasn't intellectual enough. That's why she studied art history.
And at what point did you get married?
A little over a year later.
And what about the weekend house?
Well, the weekend house had originally been bought by Liesel's mother, and then Liesel had added some acreage to that. First it was 4 acres and a house, and then how that is, she bought an adjoining parcel of 50 acres, and when I came into the picture, so there were 54 acres, and then we were able to buy another 30 acres. So then there were 84 acres in the forest. But the weekend house was used by us and by my mother-in-law. We took her out a lot. We would go together, and so it was a wonderful thing. And we would spend the evenings, and I would read to my mother-in-law, who was nearly blind, German books, and because she loved to read, and it was horrible for her not to be able to read.
Now, where was the house located?
In Sage Canyon. It went from Highway 128 all the way up to Chapelet's Vineyard.
Oh, well, not far from here.
5 miles from here where we are sitting.
Ah. And what happened to that property?
Well, first of all, when we decided to try out country living, when we were contemplating to move to the country, we moved there to test ourselves, you might say, whether we could hack it. And so we moved there and spent some time there. Liesel was teaching at UC at the time. And then when we decided that we could do it with country living, then we started seriously looking for agricultural property. And then eventually, when we found this place where we are now, we sold what we had. But meanwhile, we had gotten a right of first refusal on our neighbor's property. And eventually we got that. So it's right adjacent to what we used to own. And that is where our son and daughter-in-law are living now.
Oh, I see. And that's on Sage Canyon Road.
That's on Sage Canyon Road, right.
And now the weekend property that you and Liesel had originally, was that planted in vineyards?
No. That was just open space. That was beautiful. It was north-facing slope with, for here, a pretty nice forest. I mean, this isn't forest like the northeast of the U.S. or northwestern Europe, with tall trees. Trees are kind of small in California.
And had it been used for agricultural purposes?
Well, originally there was 160 acres as a homestead, but already then when they had these homestead laws were pretty loose, and all you had to do is plant a few apple trees, and then you got the land for free. And this is exactly what happened. The apple trees, there's still about 3 or 4 left, and other than that, people had a little hunting there and a little firewood, but it was nothing.
And it was a simple house.
Oh, yeah. There was a simple house.
That was there.
Yeah, but there was another house we bought with the 50 acres. All was very, very simple. This was the exact opposite of what we now have with McMansions. In those days, people with less money lived in those locations. And so then they became weekend places or hunting cabins or something like this. And now all of a sudden you have McMansions. And now you have people who have too much money, who cut down the forest and feel obliged to plant vineyard instead, and of questionable economic and real value. And so that is all completely changed. Completely changed.
So you're talking about the hillsides.
Yes.
The use of the hillsides.
Yes, and there's an example. We don't need to belabor that with names, but there are so many McMansions and there are vineyards in the area and things like that.
So now, when did you and Liesel buy this property, which is on 3080 Lower Charles Valley Road?
Correct. We bought that in 1974.
And did it already have vineyards?
Yes. Now, this is interesting. This little valley here is one of the earliest agricultural areas of Napa County and probably of California, because it was established as a land grant. This was one of the last land grants the Mexican government gave to a Yankee, Mr. Childs, Joseph Bollinger Childs. And he brought people from Tennessee over here. They were allowed to work for him for $1 a day. They built a grist mill, they built an adobe house, and they put in fields. And very soon that they plant vineyards on the hillsides, a little bit here and there. But the earliest crops are cereals. And what most people don't realize is in the 1840s and 50s, there was no Central Valley for agricultural purposes. There was all wetland. And when the influx of people came in 1849 and 50 for the gold rush, they desperately needed food for those people. And all of a sudden, areas like this were important, and for one very specific reason. All the counties that bordered on the bay had one decided advantage, and that was transportation. You could put the stuff on boats and bring it up the Sacramento River.
And now for the transcriber, can you give the name of the rancho that was given to Joseph Ballinger Childs?
It was called Rancho Catacula.
Yes. And do you recall anything else about those early days when Childs was this property here actually? It was part of Childs.
Oh, that was part of the
of his homestead.
Yeah. No, it wasn't a homestead. It was a rancho.
Yes,
and his house and the grist mill were about nearly a mile to the north of here. But the whole land grant was about, I figure, 10,000 acres.
Yes.
And but he was an entrepreneur. He was a speculator, and he would go back and forth between here and the areas where there were settlers already, and brought people across the Great Basin. Later on, he brought cattle and sheep, and for a while he owned land basically from here to what is now Davis, if you can imagine that. He gained a lot and he lost a lot. And of course, in 1846, when California became Mexican territory, American territory, he was immediately a Yankee again. And that had one big advantage. He didn't have to deal with squatters.
Okay. So we were talking a little bit about the history of this particular property, and I wanted to ask you how many acres this property has.
This property has over 400 acres, and what Childs did early on, he basically cut slices through the land grant from hilltop to hilltop. And in those days it was very simple. There was no planning department and no public hearing or anything. He just did it. And I'm sure there were mistakes made, intentional and unintentional. And the key thing was that each property had access to the road, that they had some water, and that they had some plantable land for agriculture.
And when you purchased this property, how many acres of grapes were here?
At the time, there were about 30 acres of grapes and 20 acres of walnuts.
Who did you purchase the property from?
From a family that has essentially disappeared from Napa County. They had been here 10 years. They were from back east, and the man wasn't really equipped to do this. And the family of the founder of this property, the builder of the house, the builder of the winery, and so on, was here until 1961. And between 61 and 74, there were two parties here who owned this until some stability returned in the form of Liesel and myself.
So the 30 acres that were in grapes, what kind of grapes were those?
Oh, there was Zinfandel and Sauvignon Vert, which is a real junk white variety. But they were all old, and there was a little bit of new planting of Cabernet Sauvignon and Chenin Blanc. But basically, anybody could see that the place had to be completely replanted and redeveloped eventually.
And did you know anything about grape growing at this point?
Honestly, I thought I knew a little bit. I knew a lot less in reality, but something was very important. In those days, we had a friend, and his name appears in conjunction with the Egg Preserve again, Dick Stelzner, whom my wife had met through another friend in San Francisco, and who helped her and her mother to find the weekend place. And he had married a German woman, and so they had all become friends, and when I came, we were all friends. And he promised to help me. He was doing vineyard management, and he seemed to be light years ahead of me. And so I felt I was kind of secure under his tutelage. And so that's why we had the courage to start.
And where was Dick Stelzner located, on the valley floor? Or?
Yes. He had property in Stag's Leap, where he still has property. But they were living at the time in the city of Santa Helena, he and his wife.
And then farming
and he was farming also for other people.
And so did he start out farming for you?
Yeah, he helped us somewhat. The unfortunate thing was that everything he touched became a disaster. And everything I did on my own, so to speak, worked fairly well. And eventually we had a falling out, which we don't need to belabor. But I do have to recognize that it was psychologically, for me, extremely important to do this, because I'd grown up as an intellectual. But there was another very small item in my life that played an enormous role, actually, when my wife and I got married in 1968. We found out that the bridge to our country house, our weekend house, was falling apart. And our neighbor and we had to figure out how to replace it. And we ended up building a bridge. I'd never thought I could build a bridge. But the bridge became sort of a psychological, I don't know how to describe it properly, but it became incredibly important because I could see that I was capable of doing things with my hands and was capable of being out there on my own with my wife and with our neighbors, and we did it all together. and I learned enormous amounts from this man, and that gave me an enormous amount of confidence. I mean, I knew everything about books, believe me, and nothing about bridge building.
Now, when you, by the time you had purchased this property,
Yeah.
you had stopped your graduate studies at Berkeley.
Well, I passed my exams, yeah, but I was teaching here in Napa at the college, and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. And then I have to also say, my wife and I were caught by the wine bug. Everybody around us, was talking about wine and agriculture. And one other thing, everybody was moving back to the country. You might recall that time. Remember where I came from UC Berkeley. That's where Earth Day was invented, right? I do remember the people who were moving to Mendocino, and there was self-sufficiency, back to nature, getting away from it all. This was really in the air.
And the whole influence from Rachel Carson and